Welcome, everyone, to this week's episode of 15 Minutes into Big Ideas. Always, we're glad to have you with us. I want to recommend a specific resource to you that I've become involved with, and that is Begin in the Word. If you've heard of Begin in the Word, you know they have a YouTube channel and a Facebook page that has a ton of textual studies. So rather than producing one study a week, they're producing 3 or 5 a week on various passages in the New Testament and the Old Testament. There's things in Proverbs, things in the Minor Prophets, things in Job, there's things in the Gospels, there's things in Hebrews, covering a ton of ground over there. A really wonderful resource, and I highly commend to you those studies over there. I've also joined that. I'm reusing, full disclaimer, reusing some of my notes from James, not just reusing, but revitalizing them. So, the James stuff has been 3 years ago, and I learned a lot about presenting digital media, so it's kind of getting some new life over there. I'd encourage you to check it out, check that stuff out, or my stuff, or their stuff. It's all really good, and hopefully for the glory of Christ. So, with that, let's look at Philippians chapter 1, verse 28 and 30. Philippians chapter 1, verse 28 and 30, and you go over there and Begin in the Word on Facebook and on YouTube. Our reading today says, "And in no way alarmed by your opponents, which is a sign of destruction for them, but of salvation for you, and this too from God. For to you it has been granted for Christ's sake, not only to believe in him, but also to suffer on his behalf, experiencing the same conflict which you saw in me, and now hear to be in me." So this text is really connected to our last text. It starts with the word "and." So in some sense, we're really kind of cutting ideas in a way that's a bit unnatural, to where we've got this text really relies on the last text, and to understand it, we need to understand this one, and to understand this one, we need to understand that one. So they really kind of would go together in a bit of a more natural way. Really, 28 and 29 is kind of the place where it might be a bit more natural, but we really want to be thorough and flesh out each of the ideas that we see in here. We want to understand how they contribute to the logical order and progression and flow of thought of the letter. That's all well and good, but sometimes we run into time troubles, and I put 15 minutes in the title of the podcast 3 years ago, so we're pretty well stuck with that. So in those rare occasions where you can't optimize time and depth and the natural grouping of ideas, we're going to sacrifice on the natural grouping ideas for an episode or two, and then look to get things ironed out as soon as we can, so that we're grouping these ideas appropriately and in the right levels, because we want to look at all of it and try to keep it all together. So with that, justification of oneself. Let's remember what we said here. Paul has called them to conduct themselves in a manner worthy of the gospel, which characterizes really the entire swath of information of the letter from chapter 1, verse 27 to about chapter 2, verse number 18. And Paul has kicked this off with two attributes. Two attributes are standing and they are striving. And these have to do with their ability to retain the truth of the gospel, but also to press forward. More than that, Paul has talked about the need to do this together, which will serve as the overarching idea for the next several months. If you know chapter 2, the beginning is going to talk a lot about the attitudes that we need for mutual cooperation in the gospel. And last week, we really saw this whole, living worthy of the gospel, of conducting ourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel. We saw that what? It's the standing and the striving together. Today, we're going to see more about the how. What is the manner in which we do that? Why are we able to do that? Our big idea today is going to be stand and strive with boldness. Stand and strive with boldness. To understand what it means to do that and how we can do it and why we should be able to, we're going to look at number 1, don't be alarmed. Number 2, we are blessed to suffer. And number 3, we suffer with others. So don't be alarmed. We are blessed to suffer, and we suffer with others. Alarmed, blessed, and others. So let's dive in. As we mentioned in the intro part of our text here, we start with the word "and," which connects us back to last week. So we stand fast in one spirit with one mind, striving together for the faith of the gospel, and in no way alarmed by our opponents. So this standing fast and this striving for the faith are done without a fear of our opponents. Part of the reason we need to stand strong and strive is because we have opponents. The Christian life is not just a step onto easy street where we kick back and enjoy and God just pours his blessings on us like we're sitting on a beach and there's people just coming on, waiting on his hand and foot. Rather, the gospel means we join a cosmic struggle, a war between good and evil, and we are changing our fealty. We are changing our fealty and our devotion and our allegiance from the side of the world over to the side of Christ. When we think about a battle or a war. We might recognize and fixate on the danger, but instead of dread and fear, Paul heartens them not to be afraid. Now, are they to not be afraid because their opponents don't pose a legitimate threat? No, certainly not. There is a legitimate threat that they have here. He wouldn't say that they need to stand firm and to strive if there wasn't some difficulty there. If Paul were telling them they weren't harmful, that they shouldn't be afraid because there's no threat here, then there's no effort that they need to give in order to withstand. For example, if I told you the difference between standing firm and striving against a lion or a bear versus standing firm and striving against a mosquito, one of them actually poses a threat. One of them doesn't. It only makes sense to stand firm and to strive against a lion or a bear, something that has some level of threat to you, whereas a mosquito is really just a nuisance. The people that are our opponents, that are the opponents of the Philippians, are not just a nuisance. We must keep our wits about us. What ground does Paul give them not to tremble? And the next phrase here really has a puzzle that I think helps us to answer this. Paul says their boldness will be assigned to them of their destruction, but of the Philippians' salvation which comes from God. What's going on with that? Why is it that Paul says their boldness will be a sign of judgment against their enemies? Well, it's because their boldness is in God's power to save them and to raise them at the last day. It's a boldness and a declaration that God will save them. Looking at the back half there, their lack of intimidation is a fruit of their salvation or their confidence in God, and therefore this idea of them standing bold is a awareness. It is a testament to the coming destruction of those who oppose the cause of Christ. This confidence, once again, goes back not to our own selves. As it says, this confidence is from God. This trust in our salvation, this sign of our salvation is from God. This is, as we go back a couple weeks ago, to the idea of living as Christ and dying is gain. We have no fear what man can do to us because of a recognition of God's power, and a recognition of God's power to save us and to destroy the wicked. Next, Paul says for, which is a word of causality, and gives us the reason for what we just read. Why is it that you shouldn't be alarmed? Because it has been granted to you for Christ's sake not only believe, but also to suffer. It has been granted to you not only to believe, but also to suffer on behalf of Christ. An incredible statement. Shocking on the surface. We shouldn't be afraid even when we suffer because it is something that is granted by Christ. And there's I guess, three things as I'm looking at my notes here that are important in this. Is that suffering is essential, it's going to happen. Number two, it is actually a gift. And three, it's on behalf of Christ. So it's essential, a gift, and on behalf of Christ. To say that suffering is essential means that serving Jesus will cost us. Ultimately, we believe that suffering and difficulty are going to happen. It's an inevitability. As we think on the gospel and preach the gospel, we should not withhold the cost of the gospel because suffering is going to happen. Second, suffering is a gift. It does not say that suffering is a curse or a punishment, but from God, on Christ's behalf, it's been granted to us to suffer. There's going to be difficulty. And that is viewed as a blessing. We'll see why in just a moment. But as we think about this, those of us who are Christian leaders need to remember that when we invite people into the work of the kingdom, we are inviting them to suffer. That suffering is a privilege. Sometimes I've held back and I don't ask people to do things, because I don't want to put them out. I'll just be the one who takes the difficulty there. And indeed, church leaders should realize as they ask people to do things, they're asking them to suffer. But they shouldn't run over and abuse them, but we also shouldn't withhold the privilege of suffering for the cause of Christ, because it is that. Similarly, as the last thing we mentioned there, suffering is on behalf of Christ. Our suffering is not wasted or meaningless. It is not just wasting away. It is for Christ. Just as our Lord suffered for us, now we suffer for him. We embody him and his character in order to advance his cause. Our suffering furthers the cause of his mission. It furthers his goals and his glory. In many ways, there's not anything that's much more representative of the character of Christ than to suffer on behalf of others. And we do that for others and for the cause of Christ as well. All right, final point. Paul doesn't leave the Philippians with this idea of suffering as it's been granted to y'all to suffer, now deal with it. Instead, he shares his personal reflection and his experience, that he said, for me to live is Christ and die is gain. I'm suffering, and it's the greatest thing. And now you guys get a chance to do that. You're experiencing the same suffering that you saw and now here is in me. As with any good leader, Paul isn't asking the Philippians to do anything he isn't willing to do himself. He's not pointing and saying, hey, y'all go suffer while I, enjoy the goodness of it. He is the first into the breach. He is leading the cause of Christ, and he's saying, come do as I do. Paul's not asking them to do anything he's not willing to do, but he's pointing to his example to show the blessing of suffering for Christ, who we will see in the next chapter has humbled himself for us. Notice, Paul talks about the same conflict that they saw in him past tense, and now here present tense. Notice in the seeing, it implies a previous observation of Paul's suffering, whereas current, they're just aware of it. They're not actually presently perceiving it. We might ask, what suffering is Paul talking about that they saw? But if we do much historical reflection at all, we'll recall that Paul preached the gospel first at Philippi. He was in prison for preaching the gospel and healing people who were demon-possessed. Acts chapter 16 for more details there. But because of that imprisonment, what happened? What happened because of that imprisonment? Well, the Philippian jailer came to faith and was baptized, and him and his whole house. And I have to wonder, as I think upon this, if you'll forgive my musings for a moment, I wonder if he's still at that church. So maybe 20 years later. At the very least, maybe some of his kids and family that were baptized that night are still at that church. At the very least, their story is known. I wonder if that jailer isn't one of the overseers or deacons that we read about in verse number 1. Maybe not him, but some of his sons or son-in-laws. Obviously, it's impossible to know. But the Philippians still have the lived experience of seeing firsthand that the suffering of Paul led to the saving of that man and his household. And that's why they now get a chance to do this, to experience it for the good of others and ultimately for the sake of Christ. Paul's ministry in Philippi was marked with suffering, which benefited the Philippians. And if they want the gospel to go forward, they must do the same as well. They must suffer for the sake of Christ and for the sake of others. So to conclude here, this standing firm and striving, both of which are done together, is completed with boldness because of our confidence in God. It's not a confidence in ourselves, but a trust that God will vindicate the righteous, and that as we believe that living is Christ and dying is gain, that Christ lives through us, we can be bold in the face of our opponents in spite of suffering. That boldness isn't just they're going to make fun of you, but some of them will go to their death because of the cause of Christ. But they see it as a privilege to suffer for their Lord, and they do it in faith, in trust that Christ will be magnified and people will be changed by it. In America, we have not suffered. In fact, we've been blessed so long with Christianity being free and a privilege, and I'm all for that. I'm all for Christianity being a privilege. But it's like we've forgotten that maybe suffering is the path forward. That maybe the gospel's best way to advance is through people embodying the suffering of Christ, to where we don't even think or believe that something bad happening to us could lead to the furtherance of Christ. And we need to get that back in our minds. We need to get that back in our minds, that if we suffer for Christ, it will lead to the advancement of the kingdom. We may not understand how or why or in what manner, but we trust that the suffering of Christ led to our benefit, and our suffering for others will lead to the glory of Christ. That doesn't mean we should run masochistically into suffering. It doesn't mean we should make an idol of suffering. It doesn't mean we should lead with our chin asking for it. It doesn't mean that we should even try to avoid it or flee if possible. Rather, it means we shouldn't think of it as the worst thing in the world. Paul uses his example to tell people they're not alone, to encourage him, and further stresses the point that we walk together in one mind. Paul's example shows us how much we rely on each other for hope and experience as we walk together worthy of the gospel. So how do you feel about the prospect of suffering for Christ? Does the idea of persecution terrorize you? Or are you content in your soul? Is it frightening to you? Are there ever times you experience any discomfort or suffering for Christ at all? Are there ever times when you're pushed into difficulty because of the gospel, or is it all just surface level and basic and there's never any cost for you? Are you able to find joy in that difficulty if you do experience any at all, or is it just a misery to you? How can the example of others who sacrifice motivate you? How can you reframe your perspective so that you take service and joy in the suffering of your King and on his behalf? How can the prospect of Christ working through you, of living being Christ and knowing him more deeply, and the gospel being advanced, not by your strength, but by your weakness, recalibrate your mind when it comes to suffering? Thank you so much for joining us today on 15 Minutes and a Big Idea. Today's big idea: stand and strive with boldness.